You're listening to Milwaukee Mafia, your podcast dose of Wisconsin Mafia and true crime history.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Milwaukee Mafia Podcast. I'm Eric.
I'm Gavin.
Gavin, we're back again after a long break.
Yes.
What do you got for us today?
Oh, man. So you were on a long break. People listening don't know because the magic of podcasts, we're consistent. But you were traveling through the South for a while there.
Yes.
We're here. I've got a genealogy episode, which right off the bat, let me clarify, it's gonna be cool.
Okay.
So if me saying that scares you, don't. This is gonna be awesome. You're gonna be like, wow. If that's like, ugh, this one's not for me. No. Stay tuned. This is going to rock your world. Let me tell you. This is cool.
I think you might be overselling it.
I am
just
not.
Slightly.
I am not, because I think this is you're going to be like, wow. We're still in the early 1960s. We're pretty much going to be there for a while. I mean, forever. And at the time that Frank Balistrieri is about to become boss, up through the first couple years where he is the boss, he brings over a couple guys from Kansas City. I mean, I don't know how this was worked out. He's like, hey, I need some new guys to come into Milwaukee, kind of put the fear into people. So he gets people from Kansas City to come over. And I want to talk about those two guys, but I'm going to do it in a very roundabout way, because we're going to talk about family history here and how this plays into these guys coming over. All right?
Okay.
All right. I don't know of another example, and there may be one, but I don't know of another example where two cities have mafia families with such strong family links. I'm not aware of it as much as Milwaukee and Kansas City.
Interesting.
And Milwaukee does not have this with Detroit. It doesn't even have this with Chicago. It's just not a thing. There are, there's some links. There's cousins everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some, but not like this. This is ridiculous.
Really?
Yeah. So there's one branch of the Kansas City Mafia where their last name is Balistrieri. And I don't know if it's going to be, if they say it the same way I'm saying it, but I'm going to do this for emphasis. Their last name is Balistrieri, whereas in Milwaukee it's Balistrieri. Okay?
But it's probably just a pronunciation thing?
Right. There's a slight spelling difference, but if you go back far enough, it's the same family. Like,
okay.
It's distant. It's distant, but they are the same. There's just, across the board, there's like 5 different spellings of this name. That just happens.
Mm-hmm.
They are, if you go back far enough, the same family. By the time the one group gets to Kansas City, it's Balistrieri, and in Milwaukee, it's Balistrieri. Okay?
Okay.
All right. We're primarily focused on 2 brothers. One, whose name is Frank, because we got to keep this.
Yeah,
we got to keep this confusing, So there's Frank Balistrieri, who I don't know was a mafia guy, but I suspect that he probably was, based on the fact that his children were heavily involved, and another guy named James. And James definitely was. James is even considered by some to have been the leader in Kansas City for a while. And I am by no means an expert on Kansas City, so somebody could say that's very wrong. Some sources do say that he was a pretty top guy. Mm-hmm. All right. Frank, the brother Frank, he's got a handful of kids. One of them is Vito Balistrieri. All right.
No, that is just weird too.
Yeah,
because Vito Guardalabene.
Well, these are just common names.
Yeah,
these are just common names. He's got that. Here's kind of like the odd things about this, right? So Vito, who is the son of one of these Kansas City guys, he marries Rose Balistrieri of Milwaukee, who is an aunt of our Frank Balistrieri.
Okay.
All right. I know this is going to get super confusing, but just go with me on this. All right. So there's that. There's a daughter. This is Vito's sister. There's a daughter named Catherine Balistrieri of Kansas City. She marries John Pachuro of Milwaukee, who is our Frank Balistrieri's uncle. All right.
Okay.
Okay. Still coming with me here?
Yeah.
All right. There's another mob guy in Kansas City named Jimmy Balistrieri, who for a while comes to Milwaukee and works in gambling in Milwaukee. There's another daughter, Anna Balistrieri, who she marries a Kansas City mob guy named John Moley. There's Buster Balistrieri in Kansas City, who he's one of the two guys I was talking about who comes to Milwaukee, that our Frank brings into Milwaukee to kind of put the fear into people.
Mm-hmm.
The other guy that comes over is Buster's brother-in-law, a man named Joe Guerrera. They're not technical. I don't think they're brother-in-law. They refer to each other as brother-in-laws. They are married to sisters.
Okay.
To me, that's not a brother-in-law, but that's how they call it themselves.
Okay.
Those are the two guys that come over. This just keeps going. Another sister here, sister of Buster, Vito, Jimmy, Anna, Catherine, all these people who have these marriage ties to Milwaukee. Another sibling is Mary Balistrieri of Kansas City, who marries Peter Balistrieri of Milwaukee, who is Frank's brother.
Okay.
So we've got this entire family of siblings who are married to Frank's brother, uncle, aunt. The links are just ridiculous here, right?
Okay. So can I ask a question about this then?
Yeah.
So if these links are tied so tightly together, do we see a lot of connection between, like, did the Milwaukee Mafia and the Kansas City Mafia work hand in hand on a lot of things? Or is there really no evidence of that? It just seems to be like they just were marrying each other.
Primarily just marrying each other. And that's kind of the weird thing about this is in the mafia world, like, marriages are largely arranged. Like, so this isn't like a coincidence.
Okay.
These marriages were probably, at least half of them were probably decided. It wasn't like they were all coincidentally like, oh, I'm going to marry another member of the family. So this was kind of set up that way. And the reason for that is similar to the way, like, the royal family used to do things. It's like, hey, if I have children and you have children and we're both mafia guys, if our kids are married to each other, that will bring us closer together, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because in the mafia, it's very important to have those strong blood and marriage links. If for no other reason, then you're less likely to turn somebody in if you're, their family. So there's that, yeah. But there isn't a strong amount of, like, where there is some. I mean, going forward, Kansas City will pop up again and again, but it's like always really dumb things. Like if Frank needs a new car, he'll go to Kansas City and he'll get a car from somebody there. There aren't, like, major crimes where they're working together. It isn't as strong as you would think based on how much there's this overlap.
And there is nothing like where I'm going to screw this up, but a Balistrieri from Kansas City moved up to Milwaukee and started the Balistrieri family. It was more like maybe two brothers came from Italy, one settled in Milwaukee and one settled in Kansas City. Right?
Basically, yeah.
So there's not really a connection between the family. Like, obviously they're related.
Yeah.
But it's not like they would have known each other because one would have spent their entire life in Milwaukee. The others would have spent their entire life in Kansas.
Right. I think that they knew that they were, like, distantly related. And there is, like, because, okay. We've talked about this like before. Like a lot of the way it works is when people immigrate from Sicily to America, like entire villages come to the same city.
Mm-hmm.
In the Milwaukee's case, the primary one we talk about is Santa Flavia, and Santa Flavia largely picked up and went to Milwaukee. So there is that overlap here, where even though this other branch went to Kansas City, they definitely have family members who've settled in Milwaukee, because Milwaukee was like the main place.
Mm-hmm.
The majority of people in Kansas City, of Sicilian Americans in Kansas City, did not come from Santa Flavia. So why this branch did, I don't know. They definitely would have friends and family in Milwaukee. So it's not like completely random.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that they were necessarily like buddies.
Mm-hmm.
They could have been.
There has to be some sort of link though, because
but these aren't cousins. These are like fourth or fifth cousins.
Yeah, and there has to be some sort of strong link, because it would make so much. Even when you say that most of these are arranged marriages,
Mm-hmm.
now that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
It also, to me, makes more sense that they would arrange marriages with people from Chicago instead of people from Kansas City, because while to us, Kansas City isn't very far away, I'm pretty sure that even in like the 60s, Kansas City was considered a much further distance than it is today to people, because flying wasn't as prevalent and things like that. It just wasn't easy to get there. So it seems weird that they chose to go the path of Kansas City rather than Chicago. Unless Chicago's like, yeah, we're not going to arrange any marriages with you guys or something.
Yeah. I mean, my guess on that is just that Chicago doesn't have, or at least didn't have, the classic textbook mafia outlook.
That's true.
Because there aren't a lot of family links in Chicago. I shouldn't say there aren't a lot. There are. It's not like super extended. It's common for there to be brothers or sons-in-laws or whatever, but not to the extent where everybody's related to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And Chicago's more multi-ethnic. Like you can be Polish and they don't care, and they even had a Japanese guy run gambling for a while. Like the being Italian isn't as important to Chicago. Right.
And I guess now that I hadn't thought of that, but now that you say that, that makes a lot of sense. Like they kind of looked at it like, well, and maybe to the little other mafias, Chicago wasn't really looked at as even a mafia because they were so much different than all the other mafias because of those reasons.
Right. And they typically aren't referred to as that way. I mean, the actual name that everybody calls Chicago is the Chicago Outfit. That's what they're called. You very rarely hear people say the Chicago Mafia. You could say that and you wouldn't be wrong, but it's not like what most people say.
And when you say most people, I think most average people like me would say mafia. Well, but anybody that's knowledgeable in the mafia calls it an outfit.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the newspaper would call it the Chicago Outfit.
Oh, do they? Okay.
Yeah. I'm not aware of the newspaper ever saying the Chicago Mafia. Like,
really?
I'm sure it's happened. For whatever reason, like outfit is the name that stuck with them. And that probably goes all the way back to Capone. I mean, I'm guessing.
Right.
Because he's kind of the guy who did this, where being Italian wasn't important anymore. And the family wasn't as strong of a thing to him. I mean, his brothers were a little bit involved in Prohibition, but not really deep into crime. He had a son. His son wasn't involved in anything. He didn't seem to apparently see it as like a family business type thing. So I don't know. But yeah, so Kansas City, yeah, and even like, so there's even one more. There's even one more case here where a Balistreri in Kansas City marries a cousin of our Frank Balistreri. I mean, I guess that's the reason I got all these papers here is because this is like my little family tree thing I printed out. But that's just basically the point I wanted to make, is like just this one family of like whatever it is, 8 kids, like 6 of the 8 kids are like married into direct relatives of Frank Balistreri. Like this is not coincidence. There is some really strong links. So when he needed guys to come over from Kansas City to kind of like be like, okay, I'm shaking things up. I'm bringing in some new guys. We're going to straighten it out. And primarily what he did at first was he got the bookies in line. He wanted the bookies to know that he wasn't going to screw around anymore. So he called up, he probably had to call up the boss, but whatever. He got Buster to come over, and Buster brought his brother-in-law with him, and they came over for a few years. And they weren't there very long. It was like 61 through 63. That's as long as they stayed. But it was long enough where they really shook things up and was like, yeah, a new guy's in charge here.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. And I guess now that when you add that he brought people in from Kansas City, now this story even makes more sense, because obviously maybe they weren't doing a lot of things together, but they were obviously very tight knit, because if he's going to call down there and ask them to send people up, and they're willing to send people up, obviously they have quite a close relationship. Yeah. Because again, it goes back to the same thing where it makes a lot more sense to call Chicago and have them send people up, right? But obviously he chose Kansas City because he was much closer to that regime, or whatever term you want to call it.
100%. Yeah. I mean, I assume people listening to this know the very basic geography. Like, Milwaukee to Chicago is not that far.
Yeah, not far at all.
But he doesn't call in a Chicago guy to get stuff done. Like, they might call in a Chicago guy for a murder or something, like just come in for the day and do something. That might happen. But for something like this involved, he goes all the way to Kansas City, which is a bit of a hike. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there is that. And they were always close families. There's always, anytime somebody gets married, even when it's not an arranged marriage, just regular marriage. I mean, big groups in Milwaukee are going to Kansas City, and Kansas City's coming to Milwaukee. Like, there's just that strong of an overlap between the two, where they're always at these functions, or funerals, or anything like that.
And do you think that primarily is driven by the fact that these two Balistreri families, and Balistrere, families settled? Do you think that's where that link is created, or do you think it's just that link was created before that, and it's just ironic that there's a Balistreri in each family?
I think it's absolutely because of this distant connection, because I don't fully get it. People who have a better understanding of like Sicilian culture might get this better than I do. I still don't fully get it, but we've talked about this, like just how important your roots are from like not just your country, but your village. Mm-hmm. So I think, just the fact, even though they're distant cousins, I think that just being from that same small town means something to them. Mm-hmm. So all the other people in Kansas, and there are many other mob guys in Kansas City who have no relation at all, I don't think they care. But this group does, because they've got that link. And it's stronger now because of the marriages and whatever. But I think those marriages occurred because they already had that cultural link. That, oh, you're from that same small town, your grandfather went to the same church my grandfather went to, which sounds so silly, like if that's not part of your culture, but I think to them it was a big deal.
And I could just see it also happening where one of these marriages happen. They bring, let's just say a guy from Milwaukee marries a woman from Kansas City. Obviously, the woman from Kansas City is going to come up to Kansas City to live with her husband. Right. And then maybe down the road, I don't know how arranged marriages work, but maybe they decide, well, this guy now needs a wife, and they want to bring in somebody from outside. Yeah. So they go to that wife and say, hey, do you know anybody down in Kansas City that, would be interested in coming up and marrying him? And then it just kind of balloons from there, and it just keeps happening, and then you end up with this big connection.
100% correct. Yes.
So,
Peter, R. Frank's brother, so he marries the Kansas City cousin girl, whatever. I don't know what word you want to use. And yes, she does. She moves to Milwaukee then. I think you're spot on there, where that that strengthens it. Where now, obviously every holiday she's got her family in Kansas City, so there's going to be that crossover there. So just that one link creates more links.
And then just over a period of time, it just keeps happening. And then somebody does a genealogy and they look at this piece of paper and they're like, this is incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's not uncommon. I mean, whether it's mob stuff or just Sicilians in general. Then I know we talked about that fairly recently. I don't remember if that was a regular episode or a Patreon episode, but I got to use my fancy word, my consanguinity, which just means like you married close blood. That's what that means. And it's just, there's been entire studies done on how common that is in Italy. It's just part of how things work.
And even today, still is it?
Yes.
Really a big thing?
I think less so in the major cities, but like in rural areas, yeah, it's still
huge, huh? That's interesting.
Yeah.
But I mean, culture changes from place to place just unbelievably.
Yeah.
It's an mind-blowing thing when you go see it and just see how different people live in different places. Like how did this happen? But I mean, why wouldn't it happen? They're completely separate from you. They don't know what you're doing. You don't know what they're doing. So they just kind of figure out what they're going to do.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know.
Interesting.
It works. I mean, I guess that's really all I got. Like, we can talk more about Buster and we could talk about more about them in the future. I really just wanted this to be like laying out how strong these links are. And as I said in the beginning, like, people would think the genealogy stuff is boring. Like, I get it. Like, I'm into it way more than the average person. I get it. But you got to admit, this is freaking weird.
Yeah, it is. It is, but as we've talked about it, it's become, I can now, like when you first said it, I'm like, wow, this is really weird.
Yeah.
But now that we've talked about it, it's kind of clearing out like, okay, I can see how this would happen. Like a bunch of factors play in effect, and I can see how it ends up this way.
Yeah.
Understanding that they're not shy about, I mean, for all intents and purposes, marrying cousins. Yeah. So, I mean, that's one part of it.
They're distant. I mean,
they're very distant.
Yeah. So they're not really cousins. I mean, they are, but not in any sense that anybody would care.
And one other thing that you talked about that I think also could play a huge role in this is, like you said, there seems to be a very big, strong connection. Like they were from this same, small city or town in Italy.
Yeah.
Like Santa Flavia or whatever.
Yeah.
Maybe it got to the point where people in Milwaukee, all the people from Santa Flavia were married or, were just so closely knit. They're like, yeah, you're not going to marry your brother. So they started looking for another group of Santa Flavia people they could cross married with because they wanted that connection to their home.
I mean, that's
town.
That's possible. I don't know. I don't know exactly how this all worked out. Yeah.
But there's so many variables that can make this happen.
Yeah.
That it's not actually that surprising.
I mean, this is all stuff that's like 100 years ago. So, I mean, I don't know if anybody knows exactly how these conversations happened and whatever, but.
And I wouldn't be surprised if you did do deep research into like the New York mob. Mm-hmm. If there was another area that kind of had that same sort of connection with them in any mob.
Really. It happens. No, well, definitely some are more. I would say the smaller mafia families, it's much more common. No, it definitely happened in New York too. I'm not going to be able to remember names off the top of my head right at this moment. I know there's instances where like the son of one mob boss in New York marries the niece of another mob boss in New York because New York's got 5 mobs. So there is instances like that where to try to keep the different families kind of not fighting with each other, they do some of that. So yeah, it definitely happens everywhere.
And maybe New York isn't the best example because they had 5 families. Yeah. They had a lot of people to work with there. So maybe it never spread past New York.
But yeah, you do see that. I'm much less familiar with New York. The Bonanno family in New York, the majority of them, or at least a very large amount of them, did all come from the same village in Sicily. So it's a similar situation there. I don't know if the other 4 worked that same way, but I know they did, where they pretty much came from the one same village. And whenever you hear that village's name, you can kind of assume if they're a mob person, oh, you're probably involved with the banana family. That's how much these villages are tied to specific
That's
places.
So crazy.
Yeah.
All right. Well, do you got anything else for this one, or should we just wrap her up?
No, we just wrap it up. Like I said, really all I wanted to get across this time was just how much the overlap is there, where somebody could be your wife, and then your wife's brother is also your uncle through marriage. And like, it's when you really like chart it out, you can be related to somebody through marriage like 3 different ways. And it's kind of weird, but
I bet you if you looked at a genealogy chart, it would almost be humorous, the lines shooting, like that would be funny to see. All right. Well, with that, we can wrap this episode up. As always, thanks everybody for tuning into this podcast. We do have a Patreon. You can find that at Milwaukee Mafia, or you can jump over directly to patreon.com/Milwaukee Mafia. Also get over to the mailing list at MilwaukeeMafia.com, or you can find a link to it in the show notes. And Gavin, you got some contact info for him?
Sure. If you want to email me, you can go MilwaukeeMafia@gmail.com. That's pretty much the only way at this point, because Eric runs the Facebook page now. So if you shoot it a message, maybe he'll answer it, but I probably won't. So,
maybe. So I should be monitoring the messages too then?
If you seriously, just email.
Just email, but
we'll use the email.
We will clear out if you decide to send something through Facebook. It might just take a really long time.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, the email is the best way. Sometimes I take a day or 2 to check it, but I've gotten so much better about it. So really, just that's your best way to reach me directly and get a response.
All right, and with that, we'll wrap this episode up. Thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see you next week with the new Patreon episode, and in 2 weeks with the regular Mafia episode. Thanks again for tuning in.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Milwaukee Mafia Podcast. Join us next time for another look back at Wisconsin Mafia and true crime history.